The Third Reich was one of the most terrible periods in history. But what was the role of German women under Nazi rule? Nuremberg, 1938. Adolf Hitler had just annexed Austria. For women, Hitler was a master, a guide who would set the country back on its feet. The Führer captivated them with his steely expression, his brutal racist speeches. He set himself a task to create an empire from the chosen people, the Aryans, which would rule the world for 1,000 years. Lambach, Austria. This was the village where Hitler's family lived.
There were a lot of deaths in Hitler's family. It was not unusual for children to die at the time, but there was a diphtheria epidemic, and most of Hitler's brothers and sisters died. His mother doted on little Adolf, who had survived. His mother and older sister idolized Hitler, so he was brought up by two women who would do anything for him. So they were dependent on him, and they gave in to him in order to make him happy.
Hitler had a troubled youth. His father died when he was only 14, and 4 years later his mother also died. He was shy and withdrawn, but he could get very angry. Hitler had a talent for art. He wanted to be a painter and moved to Vienna. He was rejected twice by the Academy of Fine Arts in 1907 and 1908. History might have been very different if he'd been accepted. To survive, he painted postcards which he sold. The young Hitler envied the brilliant, rich Viennese bourgeoisie. His life was wretched. He ate in a soup kitchen. Dirty and scared, he made few female conquests at that time. In 1914, Hitler joined the German army and became a dispatch rider on the front at Ypres. Twice injured, he saw death at close quarters. Brave and extremely disciplined, he survived the massacres. He finished the war with the rank of corporal and received the Iron Cross. It was the first time his merits were recognized. His regiment became his home.
Hitler was a creation of Versailles. The Germans decided to make up for the humiliation and then prepared their revenge in a sort of ecstasy. The idea of death can produce euphoria, and in the representation of reality that creates a feeling that we will at last be victorious and crush the French and their allies who humiliated us.
A woman's status after World War I was primarily poverty and defeat, but it was far superior to the status of French women. In 1919, German women obtained equality of civil rights, which French women obtained in 1944-45. My question is, what did they do with their civil rights? As a matter of fact, a large number of women moved over to the Conservatives.
After 1918, many veterans didn't accept defeat and set up militias, the Free Corps. These groups opposed communist activities. An explosive situation developed. It was a period favorable to extremist attitudes. In Russia, the Bolsheviks had been in power since 1917. In Germany, the Communist Party tried to impose its power over workers. This revolutionary party included many women who received activist training. They would vote against the Nazi accession to power. After demobilization, Hitler felt lost. He raged against the surrender as if it were a stab in the back. In Munich, his speeches fired up the people in the beer halls. At the age of 32, he took control of a small group. It would become the Nazi Party. Beirut. Hitler was fascinated by Richard Wagner's operas evoking Germanic myths and heroes. He found strength in them. The Führer enjoyed meeting one woman who helped him a lot in this dark period. Her name was Winifred, and she was the composer's daughter-in-law. Some people claim they had an affair. In 1924, after a failed coup d'etat, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in prison. He foretold war and a mission of family and sacrifice for women. Winifred sent him parcels.
Hitler was a self-taught man. He read and took in everything he read, and then he regurgitated it in Mein Kampf. He wanted to make everything German, mainly in the East, of course, and to destroy Jews throughout Europe. Women were nothing. They were companions for men, for procreation, for beauty, later for the pleasures of the warrior, before those of daily life. He had quite an archaic view of women, except that they had to be modern and sporty and so on. It was more or less to be taken literally, because everything written in it would come to pass.
From 1921, there was a huge economic crisis with endemic unemployment. The mark was devalued. You needed 1 billion marks to buy a loaf of bread. People used baskets of marks to buy goods that were becoming harder to find. Hitler, the agitator, increased his murderous speeches against democracy. The economic situation worked in his favor. After his release, Hitler rebuilt the Nazi Party. He wanted power. He was styling his identity. People flocked to every meeting. He couldn't bear the authority of the army who were responsible for the defeat. The Führer travelled across Germany by plane, an innovation. In order to give himself confidence, he carried a whip which could also defend him against attacks by communist commandos. A mortal battle was raging. Wherever he went, popular support exploded. His speeches were extremely violent.
Il fallait que Hitler soit le fiancé de toutes les femmes allemandes.
In a sense, Hitler was promised to all German women. The few affairs that Hitler had were often platonic affairs with much younger women, women he could dominate, and with women who probably didn't arouse any strong feelings in him. There was only one who did arouse strong feelings. Hitler was captivated and perhaps even dominated by Jolie, who was a strong personality, an enterprising, assertive woman who probably captivated Hitler.
Une femme entreprenante, affirmée, qui a subjugué probablement Hitler.
In Munich in 1929, Adolf Hitler set up home with his niece, Julie. They were very much in love and lived the high life. He gave her clothes, but they shared strange sexual habits. He was very jealous. Hitler forbade her to take singing lessons in spite of her soprano voice and confined her.
Ils se sont séparés.
They separated and she committed suicide. He was upset because it was probably the only time he had had strong feelings for a woman, but the relationship revealed Hitler's personality somewhat and his fear of emotional dependence.
The relationship was said to be sadomasochistic. He liked drawing her body. After his niece's death, Hitler became even more violent. Among the circle of leading Nazis was the photographer Heinrich Hoffmann. In 1929, he introduced his pretty assistant, Eva Braun, to his friend Hitler. She was 17 years old. They saw each other for 2 years, and then the relationship became more permanent. Eva had 2 sisters and was from a very Catholic family. Eva was carefree, ambitious. She wanted to be an actress. She loved power. Hitler was 43. He neglected her, and yet he set her up in an apartment with her sister, Gretel, in Munich. She spent her time with her sister waiting for her lover, who refused to marry her. Adolf Hitler was devoted to the Reich.
Sein Leben
Hitler travelled more and more. The National Socialist Party became the leading political force. In the parliamentary elections in 1932, it obtained 37% of the vote. The Communist Party collapsed. Hitler and his extremists were on the brink of power.
Wir haben ein Ziel uns gewählt und verfechten es fanatisch, rücksichtslos bis ins Grab hinein.
A woman's situation varied greatly from region to region during this period. There were few women in government. Women lacked training in politics because the basic German citizenship didn't include training in politics. In addition, many women went to church, and that didn't help with political education. Most of them could be manipulated, except the left-wing militants, who were not in the majority.
In Bonn, we met women who remembered this period, such as this teacher who was only married to this officer for 6 months before he was killed at the front.
Warum der Hitler groß wurde, weiß der liebe Himmel.
God only knows why Hitler came to power. The governments of the Weimar Republic can't have been vigilant enough. People were in great need. There was a lot of unemployment, and many people were reduced to begging.
Sehr viele Leute, die waren bettelarm.
On the other hand, women were absolutely captivated, that's the word, captivated by Hitler. Because Hitler had studied theatre, he had studied cinema, and he used technology. All Hitler's speeches were staged with sets like an opera. Women fainted when they saw Hitler. It wasn't the man Hitler, it was the representation, in the theatrical sense of the word, that they made of the man. And many women, when they were asked what he looked like, said that he was tall, handsome, blonde, and with blue eyes, since that was the archetypal good Aryan, if one can put it like that.
A remarkable speechwriter, Joseph Goebbels gravitated into Hitler's inner circle. Goebbels fell in love with a pretty woman called Magda. She fascinated Hitler with her intelligence. Goebbels became the Minister of Propaganda. In spite of his club foot, the Nazi Don Juan made many conquests among beautiful actresses. In 1931, Goebbels married Magda, who was fascinated by Hitler. The minister had many mistresses, including the actress Linda Borova, aged 23. Magda consoled herself with the role of the exemplary mother. She looked after Nazi charitable works. She was fashion's representative in the Reich. This strange couple attended every event. Refusing marriage, the Führer had promised himself to Germany. Magda Goebbels became the first lady of the dictatorship. Hitler was still merely the leader of an extremist party. He adopted the Italian fascist salute. In 1932, the Führer became a German citizen. In 1933, everything was played out after some political trickery. On the 30th of January, he took on the respectable role of Chancellor. The elderly and sick President Hindenburg thought of Hitler as the man sent by Providence. However, it was all planned. The majority of women had always voted, and they voted for him. The Nazis paraded before the Chancellor, Hitler. Terror would become his policy.
We mustn't forget that the concentration camps were created as early as 1933. That's something that people try to conceal, but they existed as soon as he came to power. So women paid the price too. There were already women being arrested and sent to the concentration camps, but people conceal that.
The construction of the autobahns was one of the great projects started by Hitler. 100,000 people were mobilized. An illusion of prosperity returned. Young girls were also mobilized in the BDM formed in 1931 and led by Gertrude Scholz-Klink. A period of compulsory service was required, mainly in the countryside. For boys, the Hitler Youth had one objective: to harden them into the invulnerable warriors of tomorrow, capable of conquering vital lands to the east. Hitler was revered.
They went into families to recruit the girls. I know that my sister was fanatical. She was appreciated. I think that's why she joined, and it was worth it, because she quickly moved up the ranks. At the age of only 16, she led a BDM section. They organised community evenings, played guitars around the campfire. That was all.
In Nuremberg from 1933 onwards, the Nazi Party organised a huge rally every year. Over 1 million party members gathered for a week. Each day was devoted to an organisation. On this day, youth was in the spotlight. The Führer seemed to like blonde plaits.
This is an argument which partly explains the success and the love which women had for Hitler. He talked to them about health, about beauty, and about morality. Health, you're blonde, you're beautiful, which was often true. Girls love to dance. You're healthy, you belong to the superior race. So health was a word which was important in Nazi ideology. Thanks to you, the men will be even stronger. And look how handsome you've made your men. And then morality. Thanks to you, the whole world will experience 1,000 years of happiness, and the whole world will eliminate gypsies, homosexuals, and of course Jews. And all that was being done in the name of morality, beauty and health. Who could oppose it?
Au nom de la morale, de la beauté et de la santé. Qui peut être contre?
In 1935, state anti-Semitism was instituted. From then on, Jews were banned from public service. They were stripped of Reich nationality. On the 28th of May 1935, having been abandoned by her lover, Eva took sleeping pills in an attempt to commit suicide. She wrote, "Adolf only wants certain things. Oh, if only I'd never met him." Triumph of the Will. This was the grandiose propaganda film made by Leni Riefenstahl. This talented artist contributed to the establishment of Nazism and made the Führer's picture known among the people. Leni was an exception in this macho universe. Under pressure from Hitler, Goebbels was forced to release considerable sums of money. Some claim that she was the Führer's mistress. In Nuremberg, Leni and her crew invented new camera techniques, such as this dolly tracking shot. The Third Reich had barely 70 million citizens. Himmler, the terrible leader of the SS, had two missions: to exterminate the Jews and to populate the future territories in the east with new Aryan families. It was impossible. The only solution was a human breeding program. Himmler needed the population of the Reich to be strong. They had to avoid the 700,000 abortions that took place every year when young women were abandoned. The SS created reception centres, the Lebensborn, meaning fountain of life in German. Single young women came here to give birth in safety and anonymity. They could either keep their babies. The secret Lebensborn organisation would give them the means to bring them up in the Nazi doctrine, or they could give them up. The babies would be placed in Aryan families. Himmler's desire was make people have children for the greatness of the Reich. These young Aryan women were symbolically offering their children to the Chancellor, Hitler.
Then the second stage was to increase and purify the Aryan race. That was really at the heart of the great Lebensborn project, to encourage the procreation of children whose parents met specific racial criteria, pure Aryan criteria. The ideal would have been a young Aryan woman made pregnant by an SS officer. That was the ideal system, and so the idea was to encourage procreation of as many children as possible, who would then be destined to become the elite of the Third Reich. The women were willing, and some were even enthusiastic. The child was given an identity, with a false first name and even a surname. The internal system worked in secrecy, to the extent that the children's births weren't declared in the place where they were born, but on a parallel Lebensborn register, which was the only record of the real identity of the parents.
Où là, seul, on connaît la véritable identité des géniteurs.
The Nazis liked Nordic physical characteristics. They established more than 10 maternity facilities in Norway. They had no knowledge of genetics. Most of the children born were not of Nordic appearance.
On était plus vraiment dans une maternité.
This wasn't so much a model for maternity. It was more of a model for a Nazi brothel. It really must be seen that way. The lowest figures are that 9,000 children were handed over to the SS in Germany. 9 to 10,000 born in these conditions in Norway, which became, for want of a better word, the most efficient of the Lebensborn.
Himmler considered the Norwegian population to be a brother Germanic people. We met one of these Lebensborn children.
Je suis un enfant de Lebensborn.
I was a child of the Lebensborn. I was born in Norway, in Oslo, which was unusual for a German child. I am German. My parents met in Bad Tolz, which is a small town in Germany, in Bavaria. There was a big SS officers' school. My father was a captain and my mother was his secretary. Of course, she knew from the beginning that he was married, but she wanted to have a child with him. It was normal when you believed in the Nazi ideal to have a child for Hitler. When she came back from Oslo, she told everyone that I was a Norwegian child. I didn't know anything about the Lebensborn. I thought that a man had left my poor mother because he was married. I had no idea about the Lebensborn because no one talked about it. It was a secret even in Germany. Then I met my father with my half-sister. It was in Frankfurt at the station. And I saw this man open his arms and say, "Oh, I have another beautiful daughter." He kissed me and I cried in front of everyone. Even now, it's quite difficult. I couldn't believe that this man was an SS officer. I couldn't believe it. I'd always been told that he was an officer, but never that he was an SS officer. I asked him about the Lebensborn, and he told me it was a program. It was interesting, but of course completely crazy. We were very idealistic, and they exploited our idealism. That was the usual response of that generation. They weren't criminals, but of course they were the worst type of criminals.
Sauf si pour moi, tous les S étaient criminels par soi.
The Nazis scorned women's most sacred role, motherhood. France wasn't spared this ignominy, as a Lebensborn was set up in La Morlaix in L'Oise. Unusually, we were able to visit this place that was marked by historical deeds that should never have occurred.
The Lebensborn in La Morlaix is an unusual example because it must have been the last to be set up. It was opened in February 1944, which was very late, 6 months before the liberation of Paris. In fact, it was set up because France had been occupied since 1940, and by 1942 there were already 50,000 children born of Franco-German unions. That was a problem. What should be done with these children? Should the Reich look after them, or should they be left with their French mothers? So in effect, the French, whom the Nazis had originally thought a rather ill-defined, genetically uninteresting race, became a source of interest because of the number of children born of mixed couples, as we would say today. There's a French document drawn up after the war that estimates that 23 children were born or stayed at La Mollet. At the most, 20 women went there to give birth or stayed there with their babies. These women were from different backgrounds. Some were French, but there were also Flemish and Dutch women whose partners were Flemish or Dutch SS officers. For reasons of discretion, they came to La Mollet to give birth. The Lebensborn in La Mollet was evacuated on the 10th of August 1944. That's less than 2 weeks before the liberation of Paris. So it all happened very quickly, and the children were taken in buses towards the east. In fact, as the Allied armies advanced, they were taken all the way back to the original home in Steinhöring in Bavaria, where everything had started in 1935, and where, in a way, everything would end. Women were no longer considered as people. These women who were in love, captivated by Hitler, weren't considered as people at all, simply as broodmares. The children who were deprived of affection, deprived of family, deprived of culture, but biologically healthy, had little chance of a normal life, and this utopian idea caused tragedy and mass murder.
The opposition was wiped out. Hitler had taken total power. The great propaganda organizer Joseph Goebbels manipulated the Germans.
In March 1933, the first Ministry of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment was formed under Joseph Goebbels, and it became a sort of gigantic machine for transforming Germany. Their great idea was to create a new man who would represent the ideas of National Socialism. No film could be released without the Ministry of Propaganda's agreement. They had total control over the press. Real censorship was brought in, and all journalists who didn't conform were removed. That meant, for example, that in the fashion press, the high priestess of fashion, a woman named Bella Fraun, was removed. She was banned from writing because she was Jewish. In this way, the press and the women's press were censored.
The journalists took refuge in the United States. In Munich, to coincide with an art exhibition, the regime staged a kitsch street parade. Elegance hadn't disappeared completely. The wives of the Nazi dignitaries competed with each other. These floats represented 2,000 years of Germanic culture. The Nazis amalgamated Germanic mythology and that of the knights of the Teutonic orders. Hitler had set himself a sacred task to purify the race. The Führer divided his time between the Chancellery in Berlin and his comfortable chalet in the Alps, the Berghof. His mistress, Eva Braun, had moved into this idyllic place in 1938. Her family visited her. Hitler concealed her presence from the German people, and yet she was a pure Aryan with pale skin and blue eyes. The Führer was crazy about her. She lived a life of idleness with her friends. While she waited, she prepared vegetables for her lover's vegetarian meals. Eva wanted to make a film about Hitler. This footage is unique. We get to see the dictator's private life. Her sister Gretel was with her. Walter Heaven, Hitler's diplomatic advisor, was a libertine in this pre-war period. In the spring of 1940, Hitler came here to rest and to make important decisions. In a few months, he had conquered territories through daring strikes and making war. Hoffmann joked with Eva, who was filming. Hitler had just made a very important decision against the advice of his staff. He was going to invade France. Max Amann was the only friend who addressed him with the familiar du. The Führer was happy. the insult would be avenged. In May 1940, the combined use of armoured divisions and air attack defeated the French army within a few weeks. The Führer was convinced that a swift war would bring him complete victory. Thousands of refugees were on the move. A great many of the dead were civilians, women and children. Their lives meant nothing to the Nazis. Since 1935, through a combination of daring policies and the use of panzer divisions, Hitler had conquered all of Western Europe, except England, its resistance aided by its island status and its Spitfire aircraft. Berlin in July 1940. France had surrendered after heavy fighting. The dictator was received in triumph. He had become the strong man of Europe and had washed away Germany's humiliation. The people of Berlin were ecstatic. They acclaimed the strategist and his victorious army. It would be the end of the War of Flowers. The women were hysterical, but the following years were to be less euphoric.
The war had been promoted so much that everyone, and especially women, at least in the beginning, were proud to see their men go to war, as they thought they were doing something good for the country. Dying for their country was a heroic death.
Millions of young men were mobilized to fight or to occupy the new states. The Reich had doubled in size. Women often had to replace them in the fields or in the arms factories.
The women found themselves doing all the work, and they weren't at all happy about it. For example, they preferred a soldier's wife's allowance to a factory salary. They refused to do it. They were called up by the Labour Department, and they said, "Sorry, I have children. I was told to be a mother, and that's what I am. I'm not a factory worker." Hitler took notice of that, because he knew that his regime relied on popular support. They all joined the party in order to feed their family. I know many people who did so, not out of conviction, but simply in order to keep their jobs.
The great celebratory rallies were over. From 1941, the National Labour Service increased from 6 months to 1 year. The war effort had to be supported by carrying out civil protection works in particular. Nurses were also mobilized. Young auxiliaries were recruited. They received intensive training. The first fighting resulted in a great loss of life. From 1936, the German Red Cross was under Nazi control, and women were recruited.
Des Third Reiches und Volkes. Adolf Hitler.
The Berghof. The Führer wanted to conquer the vital lands to the east. A violent storm was coming. Hitler had gathered his inner circle. He was going to attack the Soviet Union before America joined the war. Eva was distraught. More war. Her Adolf would abandon her again. In June 1941, the Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. Stalin was overwhelmed, and a huge area was conquered. The Red Army had only obsolete weaponry. After the use of the scorched earth policy, the Russian winter was terrible. Very soon the invasion of the Soviet Union proved to be very bloody. The soldiers of the Red Army clung on out of nationalism and also under pressure from the People's Commissars. The front stretched for thousands of kilometers. Stalin's best ally was the Russian winter. The temperatures were inhuman. Men froze where they stood. the nurses had to face horrific situations. Operations were carried out without anesthetics. The young women worked with tireless devotion. The propaganda never stopped.
Der Führer verlässt das Hauptquartier des Generalfeldmarschall von Bock, in dessen Frontabschnitt die große Vernichtungsschlacht um Charkow geschlagen wurde.
A plan was needed from the time of Stalingrad because of the increase of announcements of men's deaths in the press. There were more and more widows, so people went back to church, which the Nazis didn't like. There were discussions between Goebbels and Hitler. How can we replace the church? What have we got? And Hitler didn't want to be a religious Führer. What should be done? All these widows weren't good for public opinion. But the girls, the young people, were devoted. It was the spirit of sacrifice, as it was called, since it was one of the services allocated to women, Opferdienst, the service of sacrifice, since 1933.
During the war, the Hitler Youth organizations took part in propaganda tasks, but also in health and civil protection tasks.
So the girls were complimented. Goebbels couldn't stand all the militant Nazi women, but even he received them to thank them for their spirit of sacrifice. But not the mothers. They had had enough.
Das deutsche Volk wehrt sich gegen die totalen Kriegsmaßnahmen der Regierung. Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?
The Berghof had become the heart of the Third Reich. The complex was made up of houses, garages, barracks for the 3,000 SS and bunkers. Overlooking the valley was the chalet where Eva lived. Eva Braun was still unknown to the Germans. Throughout the war, they didn't even know she existed. It made her very unhappy. The Führer was surrounded by his secretaries and those close to him. Although she was a kept woman, Eva was paid a salary. Officially, she made films about the Führer. He seemed very interested in the new Swiss camera he had given her. This was one of the rare occasions when these private images showed them together. However, they had separate bedrooms.
As soon as you have a racist image in your head, family no longer counts, culture no longer counts, only biology counts. People were already talking about genetics, even though genes hadn't been discovered. We'll eliminate the impure and create racial hygiene, and then there will just be us, superior men and women. But there are Polish and Finnish people who are dolichocephalic, like us. That is to say, with quite a long skull, with blue eyes and blonde hair. And look how handsome they are.
These stolen children would become Aryans. Himmler needed to populate the vast plains in the east, so a new program was launched.
The most informative example was what happened in Poland, where the SS organized the selection of children in villages and towns. The aim was to gather the children. There were race specialists who examined them according to anthropometric data, skull size, distance between the eyes, that kind of thing. So all the children meeting these racial criteria were quite simply kidnapped. Those who didn't meet the criteria were the lucky ones. They stayed with their parents. It's estimated that about 200,000 Polish children were kidnapped in a very organized way by the Nazis in Polish territory.
In the east, women too were abducted in order to procreate.
At the time when disaster for the Reich was becoming obvious, kids were forced into combat units, which were then put into action against the Red Army, despite it being totally hopeless. Children were also placed into forced labor camps. effectively forced into slavery, and all this was always for the greatness of the Reich. I think that 30% of the children were returned to their families, or at least they returned to Poland. That means a large majority stayed in Germany, because once again, those who were placed in families had no knowledge of their identity. That means that today there are people living in Germany who have no idea that in reality they are Polish.
At the same time, Eva Braun was practicing different sports in the Bavarian lakes close to the Berghof, and particularly water sports on Lake Schliersee. At the age of 31, she was very fit. Eva liked spending her holidays with her two sisters and her parents. To start with, they didn't seem to accept the fact that their beloved daughter was the dictator's companion. But as time passed, and with the privileges gained in these difficult times, the Führer was accepted. Eva wanted to maintain her good figure by practicing sports, but it was also a way to escape the news of the increasingly disastrous war. An elegant woman, she would change her outfit up to 4 times a day. The couple had pets. Eva had 2 fox terriers, and Hitler loved his bitch, Blondie. The Führer was surrounded by children, perhaps in order to fill a void. He avoided the sun. When he was gassed in the 1914 war in France, his eyes had been burnt. During this time, he sent hundreds of thousands of Jewish and Gypsy children to the flames of the extermination camps. It's hard to believe that Eva Braun didn't know the Holocaust was in progress when she filmed these monstrous figures, the organizers, Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. The Allies decided to destroy Germany by mounting massive bombing raids. By day, thousands of American flying fortresses dropped their incendiary bombs from 10,000 meters. At night, it was the British Lancaster bombers that carpeted German towns with phosphorus bombs. The losses were colossal.
I think the German women were emotionally cheated, sentimentally cheated. I emphasize sentimentally because sentiment is an emotion felt in the body and triggered by a representation. The Nazis provided them with a marvellous utopian representation: opera, happiness, the elite, beauty. They never knew, or very few of them did, that they had contributed to a crime.
The propaganda gave the impression that many women clung to the idea that the Nazi victory was still possible.
But the majority of German women believed in the final victory right to the end. I know many of my parents' friends who hadn't understood that we'd lost until the very end.
The women of the master race devoted themselves to moderate exercise in order to keep faith with the victory and to work well in the factories.
Hitler didn't want all women to succeed because he found it did more harm than good. They spread ill feeling, they grumbled, they weren't happy. It demoralized others and caused chaos in the factories. They used the Nazi propaganda to support their own argument. We don't want to do men's work. We're not physically built for it. And that's why foreign labour was brought in.
Millions of men were mobilized. German men died on the Eastern Front. The Nazis enlisted 1.5 million prisoners to keep the war industry going and to feed the population. 200,000 children were born from these relationships during the conflict. In his headquarters, Hitler was becoming weaker. He was suffering from Parkinson's disease. He was no longer master of his staff. Even the children Ava presented to him didn't entertain him anymore. The Führer was going downhill. Women had become aware of the indoctrination, but fanaticism persisted among German women. They joined the army as auxiliaries. The aim was also to keep the combatants at the front.
In France, for example, there were a lot of the grey mice, as the French called them, the famous and formidable women auxiliaries in the Gestapo administration. They had been delegated authority, but it was still the men who were in charge. To my knowledge, there weren't any women in charge of a camp. Even in Ravensbrück, which was a camp specifically for women, it was men who ran the camp.
3rd of June 1944. Gretel, Ava's younger sister, was 29 years old. She married the SS officer Hermann Fegelein, and their witnesses were Himmler and Bormann. Gretel was radiant, but 3 days later the Allies landed in Normandy. The bride knew Fegelein was a war criminal since, with his SS, he had exterminated thousands of Jewish women and partisans behind the front lines. In April 1945, the British liberated the camp at Bergen-Belsen. It was an abomination. The camp was overcrowded. Some prisoners had been transferred. A typhus epidemic wiped out 70,000 people, including Jews and Soviet citizens. SS Commandant Joseph Kramer was in charge of this death camp. "34 ferocious female SS guards spread terror. They were all volunteers. Some had answered an advertisement seeking women who wished to demonstrate their love for the Reich. 3,600 joined the SS Gefolg, the organization made up of female fanatics. In spring 1945, the Red Army surrounded Berlin. It was time for the reckoning. Goebbels mobilized the fanatics.
Und wenn die ihre Gewehre schultern und ihre Panzerfahrzeuge besteigen, dann haben sie nur ihre erschlagenen Kinder und geschändeten Frauen vor Augen, und ein Schrei der Rache wird aus ihren Kehlen emporsteigen, vor dem der Feind erblassen wird.
For weeks, the Red Army soldiers had been fighting with determination to crush the Nazi troops who were stubbornly hanging on. The communist soldiers spread terror, most notably by raping more than 2 million German women.
Ja, sogar meine Mutter von 60 Jahren haben sie nicht geschont, sondern haben sie auch bestialisch vergewaltigt. Bestialischen Hort. Sogar meine Schwester und meine Mutter in bestialischer und tierischer Weise haben sie misshandelt. Alles täglich betrunken.
People always forget, although I certainly don't, that the first women to suffer were the Soviet women during the German occupation. It's the reversal of the situation in a war that was dreadful from the start, as Hitler had declared that there were no laws anymore. I've often criticised German historians for having a very selective memory about that. If you look at the numbers, I don't like doing so because this is a very delicate subject, but you can see that many women claimed money for abortions, so they wouldn't bring racially impure children into the world.
Pour ne pas mettre au monde des enfants racialement impurs.
was lost. Hitler barricaded himself in his bunker beneath the Chancellery with the last of the fanatics. Eva joined him against his advice. On the night of the 29th of April 1945, he married her, and then she committed suicide by taking poison. The Führer shot himself in the mouth. The partly burnt remains of the diabolical couple were found later. The world was astonished to discover Eva's existence. Magda Goebbels represented the ideal mother of a large family. Since the Führer was dead, life had no more meaning for the Goebbels. As fanatics, they committed suicide with their 5 children, all of whose names started with H. In the depths of the Chancellery bunker, Magda gave them a sleeping drug and then a poison capsule. The Soviets found the body of Goebbels clenched in an expression of hatred.
So finally, the German women were rewarded with the contempt of the man they had adored, Hitler, who said, "My people aren't capable of realizing my dreams and the 1,000 years of happiness that we should have brought to the planet. Therefore, let them die."
The defeat of the Third Reich was total. 80% of Berlin was destroyed.
I especially pay tribute to the women who cleared away the ruins, as the men were prisoners. It is to their credit that many women made a major contribution to the rapid reconstruction of Germany. That was the famous German miracle that would have been unthinkable without women, since there were hardly any men left.
The women of the Third Reich paid a very high price for their fascination with Hitler and his Nazi doctrine.